Welcome to It's Bloody Complicated, the Compass podcast. I'm Neil Lawson, your host and director of Compass. Joining me to help manage the questions is Grace Barnett from the Compass office. Hello, Grace.
Hello.
These are unprecedented times, and we need to rise to the new and enormous challenges we now face. Over the next few weeks, we'll be speaking with writers, thinkers, politicians, journalists and public service workers about how we come out of this mess in much better shape than we went in, a good society after COVID-19. These conversations have live access for Compass members who can put their own questions directly to our guests. If you'd like to participate in a live call and help support all of our work, go to compassonline.org.uk/podcast to join Compass today. Otherwise, sit back, relax and enjoy this week's podcast. The virus impacts on everyone, but it impacts on them differently. Joining this week to discuss the crisis and the future of progressive politics is Layla Moran, the Liberal Democrat MP for Oxford West and Abingdon since 2017. Before that, Layla was a maths and physics teacher who is now tipped as a leading candidate for the party's leadership. The format will be that I'll ask Layla a few questions and then open it up to Compass members on the call for questions and comments before we finish within an hour. Please, anyone on the call, keep your comments brief so we can get as many in as possible. And as Zoom etiquette demands, you'll be kept on mute unless invited to speak. And you can post your question in the chat box, which you'll find at the bar at the bottom of the screen to the right of the mute button. If you want to tweet about this, which I hope you do, the hashtag is It's Complicated. And finally, note that this conversation is being recorded to go out as a future podcast. So, Layla Moran, how are you and where are you?
I'm all right, thank you. I'm in Oxford. I live with my sister. I always say it's a sad state of the world where the only way I could afford a house anywhere near Oxford was to buy with my sister on an MP salary and combining it. And it's just, it's mad, but we can go there some other time maybe, or even on this call. Yeah, I'm really good actually. I'm all right. I've settled into lockdown life. I'm actually quite enjoying not having the commute to Westminster as much. And I will just say, I was slightly late coming here because, believe it or not, we've just had a historic moment that no one seems to be noting. We've just had our first virtual vote in the House of Commons ever in our history. And I know that we're going to come to this later, but there are some things post-COVID that I just want to keep because I think this could be transformative in the inclusivity of the Houses of Parliament. And for what it's worth, I think that's a big reason why Parliament doesn't feel like it's responsive to the wider electorate, is that it's not as connected, and this would be a great way to keep connected. So I hope we keep that.
Fantastic, good. And we're learning about that as well because we've been doing these calls since the crisis hit. And, we've been able to welcome our members into lots more conversations, doesn't matter where they live, who they are, as long as they've got an internet connection, then they can join in. Well, that's fantastic. And let's hope that does continue the other side of the crisis. And, we're going to work on that with you and other progressive MPs to try and lodge that kind of new e-Parliament stuff. So tell us a bit about you, how you became a Liberal Democrat. Kind of what was the moment? Was it a book? Was it can you remember the moment? What led you to...
I can actually.
Go on, reveal all.
Well, I was a teacher, so I'd grown up all over the world. My dad, born in Chelmsford, but then moved to Derbyshire. He was the first in his family to go to university and was, very lucky to join the European Union right at the beginning of the Commission when it was still cool in the 70s. That's kind of what people did. And he became, actually, he's a great story of social mobility because he became, off the back of joining at that point, the highest sort of ranking commission diplomat ever. And given his background, you just wouldn't ever have thought that someone like that would have done that. So I'm really, really proud of him. And the life he gave us was amazing. We traveled around lots as kids, and I lived in Ethiopia, Jamaica, Jordan, Greece, all sorts of places. And the purpose of him being there was to trade, but also to give aid. And so a lot of my childhood is a lot of childhood memories of going out to refugee camps, to other schools, meeting kids my age who didn't have access to running water. And it was the first time that they'd ever seen that. It's that kind of, those are the things that seared in my brain. And so I always had a very strong sense of sort of equality values and how wrong it is that it's not the same for everyone. But then when I became a teacher, I think really naively thought that in the UK it was better because we're a rich country. So I could understand that kind of disparity in society when you're in a poor country, but when you're in a rich country, it just didn't even occur to me that that was the case. So I became a teacher. I just loved physics. I did physics at Imperial. I wasn't really thinking about politics at that point at all. I was more interested in numbers and sums and actually connecting with kids and getting them to love science. If you were like the kid who hated maths, you were my favorite student. And so I did that for a while. And then did a master's in comparative education at the Institute of Education. And that really woke me up, because what I realized was, despite the fact that we're a G7 country, we have enormous disparity in access to education. We have some of the highest societal inequality in the world. And I just think it's unforgivable, especially in the context of the real poverty that I had seen growing up. And so I felt like I was so angry. And I decided to stop being angry and actually get and do something. And I decided then I was going to become an MP, but I really didn't know for which party, which is just a really strange way to go about it. But again, remember, I didn't grow up in this country, so I didn't have that sort of sense of tribalism that goes with politics. I just knew I wanted to change something. But what I wanted to change was education. And so I looked across all the parties. Now, to be fair to that, having said that, I mean, my dad's a Labour man, and still hasn't joined the Lib Dems, and I'm not sure he's ever going to. Obviously votes for me, but that's a different thing. And I think he would have not forgiven me for being a Tory, but I didn't stop me looking, and I did. And so I looked across all the parties and I compared their policies with what educational research showed would actually help inequality. And that was what made me choose the Lib Dems, because actually their policy was the best formulated and the closest to what the evidence would show. So it's a really geeky way of joining a party, but I'm delighted I did do it that way, because to this day, it's my burning passion.
And just talk us a bit through that. So you joined, where were you in London when you joined?
Yeah, I was in London. So I went to London Institute of Education, and so it's 2007, 2008. So at the time, right, it was very much, the end of the last Labour government. My experience of the Labour Party as a teacher earlier on in my career was actually not a very good one. I mean, I remember they were the ones who really pushed for league tables, and a lot of the data-driven stuff that we're seeing now started under them. And so I was really reticent around, some of the stuff they were talking about, because they would say education, 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 but I could see from my own experience in the classroom, this is entirely unpolitical. This was just absolutely my own personal experience at the time. And we were doing things like color coding students. So, this is 2004-5, and students, to get through GCSEs, were given colors depending on if they were going to get A to C, A star to C, and if they were on that borderline between a pass and a fail, we were being asked to focus on them and everyone else go by the wayside. So that target driven stuff I just didn't agree with. And so so it was London, and then decided to move to Oxford for a job in 2012. Came out of the classroom because I was taking politics really seriously at that point, and it's really hard to balance politics and being a classroom teacher. It's just really hard to not have the flexibility of the timetable. And so I joined a social enterprise where I was helping students in education, but through a social enterprise, and then got elected in 2012 after the massive defeat, of course, in 2015 first. I nearly gave up. I got a job as a deputy head in a school, actually, and that September of 2017, I was due to come out of politics and go back into teaching. But hey, fate took over.
And so you've come at it from a kind of education kind of and moral position on equality. So did you then discover that in the Liberal Democrats there are people that are quite like the new Labour people? I mean, I'm referring now to the kind of split between social liberalism and kind of what became known as Orange Book liberalism.
Yeah. So I think
how did you feel about that?
I mean, probably from what I've just told you of my past, I mean, I'm a more natural social democrat, and I learned liberalism by joining the party, is the way I see it. But I'm glad I did, because actually it is the root. And if I always like to challenge myself intellectually, and since then I've read the philosophical tomes of J.S. Mill, and and actually in there is a lot of social democracy. And I think it's not fair to say that there are liberals and that then there is social democracy, because actually there is so much overlap, and that's probably where I sit. But there are definitely those who are much more economically right-wing than I am, for sure. But equally, you know, I always struggle with these labels, because actually I always like to focus on what do we have in common and what do we want to achieve. And I would say the vast majority of people in the Liberal Democrats care as deeply about educational inequality and inequality in general as I do. You're often splitting hairs about the best way to then tackle that. But actually the core values that they live by is very similar.
And you're in the right place, because we all share that stuff. And I don't know whether I'm a liberal socialist or a social liberal, and I don't actually care very much, to be honest. So just, I mean, it's not been an easy period to be a Liberal Democrat, has it? You know, so I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for what happened in 2010 and the coalition, and we can talk about that. But that, you know, and then, you know, the travails over Brexit, and then the setback in the election in December. I mean, you know, how that's been, it's been a tough time for you, isn't it? I mean, talk us through that.
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, they say that the most fun you can have in supporting a sports team is to pick a team who's got highs and lows. I mean, it does feel that way with the Lib Dems. You know, I remember keenly, you know, the heady days of 2010 when we were out polling all the parties, and you know, it seemed inconceivable that we wouldn't make a huge breakthrough at that point. And then the special conference where we took that, actually, I mean, even at the time, it was quite a difficult decision, but we kind of felt in the context of that election, which seems to have been forgotten in the annals of time, there was no choice. The numbers didn't add up on the one hand, but on the other, the idea that you would then prop up Gordon Brown, having lost that election, was just politically inconceivable. And I remember going, this is going to be either going to make the party or possibly break the party. And then, as we saw in 2015, it basically broke the party, and it was an utter disaster from an electoral point of view, tempered with stuff that I'm still to this day really proud of. I mean, things like the pupil premium, given that's why I joined the party, was to try and tackle some of those ingrained issues and inequality. That was a great policy. But then you put that on the backdrop of, you know, what happened to local government funding, and people talk about tuition fees and things like that. Actually, I care more about those big, broad brush things that went wrong in coalition, that ingrained that inequality. And I'm more angry about those than things like tuition fees. But we lost the trust of the electorate, without a doubt. We lost the trust of the electorate over that period. And it was a real shame that we couldn't navigate the politics of it better. Because I think that from now on, people are going to be really reticent about coalitions. And actually that's counter to what I believe in, because I think there is beauty in diversity, and that includes diversity of views. And it's okay that you might vote differently to me, but we can still have respect for each other, and we can still work with each other. And I desperately wanted something like coalition to work in this country, because it would have changed the way that we view politics. But, you know, we've still got some work to do. And I think that's some of the work we do together, Neil, with others, is we still believe in that vision. And then 2017, I was essentially elected in Oxford, West and Abingdon off the back of a progressive alliance, recognising that actually here I am, I wasn't in coalition, I was a new, fresh face at the time. We had a Conservative MP who was very much following the line, ended up on the ministerial route. And locally, we created a progressive alliance. The Greens stood down. Very many Labour members, in fact, ended up supporting me, not just voting, but in some cases even delivering leaflets for me, so long as we didn't put them on any lists, because that would get them disbarred from the party, which I just find bizarre, because it's just the obvious thing to do in the first past the post system, but there you are. Then Brexit, and now COVID. And so I feel very much like there's been a baptism of fire over the last 10 years of politics. And it's partly why I feel ready, despite the fact I've only been an MP for 3 years. Now, I do feel ready to take on a party leadership, I think, because I've seen a lot of politics in that time, perhaps more than periods before.
So I think that the question about how we do collaborative politics in a competitive winner-takes-all system is something that we have to crack. And in particular, we have to crack the tribalism and the exceptionalism of the Labour Party, which we're busy and active trying to do, and maybe we're nudging in that direction, and all of this will be settled by the polls at some stage. But ideally, I mean, Compass would like to see, a progressive alliance style government, because we do believe that the Greens have got a lot to add, that liberalism has a lot to add alongside social democracy. But I mean, can you see how that could work given that experience of 2010? I mean, it's a very difficult thing to break that kind of competitive, Westminster two-party system and allow pluralism to flourish, isn't it?
Bluntly, Neil, I don't see this working without some form of proportional representation being part of the deal. And so I literally cannot see it working any other way, because that's the incentive. The incentive to work together in a progressive system that has first past the post would be that, you can still put your best foot forward in a seat you're not going to win, and you don't have to have your voice silenced. And what I hate about the first past the post, and what I hate about the classic way that we have been doing these alliances in whatever form they take, is that the assumption is that people are going to sort of stand down. And that means stand down. It doesn't mean necessarily not standing your candidate. It could mean, for example, not doing much literature, not putting out your message. And my own view is that every party, every voter has the right to hear from all parties equally about what they've got to offer. And then they should be able to, in a system, be able to make a positive choice about what that is. And that's what a proportional representation system would mean. First past the post encourages us to silence voices in the political debate. And actually, for what it's worth, I think it's one of the reasons why the Brexit Party, the rise of the right, that feeling among a lot of the electorate that they're just not listened to, I think it speaks to a deeper sense of resonance in our country about people feeling left behind. And it's not necessarily going to be electorally sexy to talk about this stuff on the doorstep. Most people don't think about these things, but I genuinely think it would be a sea change if we can make it happen. And I really hope that it's something that progressive politicians across the piece will continue to push for that reason.
But we are going to have to game the system to change the system, aren't we? I mean, there is no doubt about it. We're going to have to come up with some kind of electoral deal between Liberals, Labour, not to contest the same seats, not to allow the Conservatives in, to give other parties some kind of share of the spoils as well. I don't know what form that's going to take, but you can't beat a first past the post system, with a first past the post approach, can you? So we are going to have to come to some sort of arrangement, aren't we?
I agree, and it's going to be really difficult, because what we saw, places like Canterbury, for example, there was a lot of kerfuffle at the last election as to whether or not the Lib Dems should stand or not. But if you look at the way the numbers fell, and speaking to people on the ground there, they were glad, the Labour Party there were glad we stood, because what was clear was that we were taking votes off the Tories. Yeah. And that made it more likely for the Labour candidate to win. And so on the one hand, it seems unfair that actually the thing to do in places like Oxford, West and Abingdon, Labour votes don't go Tory. They either come to the Lib Dems or the Greens, or actually the Greens stayed down. So they tend to come to the Lib Dems here because we are in the best position to beat the Tory. And so it would make sense in places that are Tory facing, but in places that aren't Tory facing, it may not always make sense for us to stand down for each other because we are gaming the system, but it's counterintuitive and it feels unfair. So I think we've got a lot of work to do between now and then to build trust. And I come back to this word all the time. I think what is missing in progressive politics in general is trust and goodwill. We have, especially over coalition, I think fallen out. And there are people who will call Lib Dems yellow Tories. And if we did an analysis of actually some of the biggest hate that Joe Swinson got at the last election, and it was from the far left, not the far right, and meant that we ended up losing seats against the Tories. Now, by all means, people are more than entitled to hate people as much as anyone else. We don't, I'm not saying that they should not do that necessarily, but I think they need to give us a fair hearing, because then if you looked at the manifestos and our values, there's so much overlap. And I question how useful it is to be engaging that much energy in something that's so counterproductive given the system we have. And I think the only way we can get over this is to learn to trust each other better and to keep having conversations and to be open to each other's concerns and worries, and actually maybe listen a bit more.
And I think one of the barriers that people their worry is if we do vote tactically for you in Oxford or in other places, will you do another deal with the Conservatives? And I mean, I don't think you can work in those absolutes. That who knows under what circumstances. But I think if we can work on some campaign issues, and we'll come on to some of those in a minute, but whether it's a Green New Deal or basic income or democratic reform, and prove that trustworthiness on both sides, and that's got to begin to put us in a better position come the next election, and hope that then follows through. But I think you're absolutely right that tearing lumps out of the progressive side will just let the Conservatives in, won't it?
Yep, exactly.
So if people want to start loading any questions up in the chat things that they've got for Layla, and I'll continue with a few more for a bit longer. So you're going to stand for the leadership. We think is that now going to happen in the autumn? Are we expecting?
Well, that's our best guess. There was initially a move to postpone it for a year until May, but the mood in the party seems to be changing, especially as people are getting used to doing stuff online. So I think we are going to probably move it sooner, but I'd have no influence over that, and nor should I.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I'll ask you about kind of platform and issues, but how does that feel? I mean, particularly that what happened to Jo and how that affected her.
Oh yeah.
Are you you must be sort of slightly nervous about doing that and what it means and what it entails. You're a human being.
Of course, and what it does to your life and the scrutiny for not just you, but I mean, you sign up for this stuff, but your friends and family don't necessarily. Some more than others, in fact. And so, it is something that you don't just do on your own. You do it with everyone who's in your life, and you do it with your team at work, and you do it with your family. And so it took me a long time to get to that point where they were like, no, go for it. It's fine. You're in a good place. But yeah, no, of course, that personal side. But sometimes, and those of you who are on this call, I bet you understand what I mean by this too. You feel sort of a calling towards wanting to make the world a better place. And I feel that this is a moment where we this non-tribal stuff, where we've got this climate emergency that is facing us. We've got to engage the young people of today in politics in a way that's going to make sense to them. And I do believe that now more than ever, people need liberalism, that nurturing of communities, that nurturing of individuals that is at the heart of liberalism, and strong public services, which has come from our democratic, social democratic roots. I mean, the two combined, I think the moment is now where the Lib Dems have something important to say, and I think I'm the right person to say it. So I'm excited to stand, but yeah, it is scary at the same time. Of course it is.
And I mean, at the moment, you're working off of a low base. The polls aren't good for you at the moment. I mean, they're not good for Labour, either. This is an odd time. I guess there's only kind of one way, hopefully, only one way to go out of the polls at the moment, which is kind of upish. And what's the mood like in the Liberal Democrat Party? I mean, you're a very resilient bunch of people, aren't you?
We are. I mean, we have been described in the past as political cockroaches. In the apocalypse, there will be cockroaches and Lib Dems. No, that's horrible. I shouldn't have said that about my fellow Lib Dems, but I think it just speaks to our resilience. And our party's amazing. I mean, we are very much a grassroots organisation. When people join the Lib Dems, they know they're not doing it for their own health. They're doing it because there's something that they like. They can't do anything else, and it's just the right thing to do. And what was really interesting, speaking to, I mean, even people who defected to us from Labour, for example, they felt that it was just like they were able to breathe, because we are so bottom-up driven. That they felt that plurality of voices was allowed, and that I think is partly why, despite the last election, which was frankly not a good thing for our party at all. I mean, we should have done so much better given where we were in the polls, and it was a bit of a disaster, frankly. But we've kept our membership, and we are, well over the 100,000 mark. I think we're still at 120,000. I was honestly expecting more of a drop off than that, and it hasn't happened, and that's brilliant. So the mood in the party is we are waiting for, I think, that leadership contest to come. We've got the local elections next year to work towards. Lib Dems love local elections. We live and breathe off council elections. We love it. And so we've got that to look forward to. I wouldn't necessarily say it's sort of buoyant and happy, because no one is right now. I think everyone's very worried about the state of politics and the state of the country and what's going to happen with COVID. But I think we can also see the opportunities in this, and where liberalism and the sort of liberalism that we would be talking about would sit in that. And I think people are quite excited to engage with that.
Well, maybe the members in a minute could ask about Brexit. I mean, my kind of mild kind of criticism is that I think the Liberal Democrats endure too much and persevere too much, and happily, almost happily, take the setbacks. You know, I want you to make a breakthrough, as I want the Greens to make a breakthrough, and I want Labour to make a breakthrough and start, you know, a paradigm shift in our politics, which requires big moves and big initiatives, and not just kind of, okay, we lost again, we'll start, you know, counting the cracks in the paving stones and work our way back in another 15 years back to, you know, have another go. I think politics is now feels very urgent. Do you feel very urgent?
It does. And I feel very much like, I gave a speech in the House today where I talked about we need to seize this opportunity, because there's an opportunity off the back of this crisis where we can do things differently. And it's been a really reflective time for everyone, I'm sure. You know, everyone's at home thinking about life choices, the society around us. For the first time ever, you know, you're talking to your neighbours more, maybe. And a lot of people are saying, I don't want it to go back exactly to the way it was. I want to find that new opportunity. We talk about the Green New Deal. I've been talking a lot about, you know, a well-being economy where we don't just measure positive growth in terms of GDP. We're also looking at the way that nature is engaged in this donut, you know, and I'm very inspired by donut economics and that side of things. I think the moment has come, but it could also pass. And I'm really worried about that. And I'm really worried about Brexit, because we've got June to decide if an extension is possible. And then if a deal isn't struck by the end of the year, then we could go off the cliff edge of no deal. So as soon as we come out, potentially, we're beginning to come out of the COVID-19 crisis, we then launch into a new one, which is a no deal crisis for Brexit. And that whole space is going to just evaporate in front of us. So now is the time for us to create that paradigm shift. And the other thing to say is, unless this is just a dress rehearsal, you know, COVID-19 is a dress rehearsal for climate change. It is nothing compared to potentially what we could have to do unless we get a handle on what is a worldwide emergency that people just, it's like a slow motion car crash that we can see what's about to happen, and we've got that moment where we can change course, and we seem to just not be wanting to do it. And the lack of international response to COVID has filled me with a bit of despondency, and we still need to be focusing on that geopolitical international response to these big worldwide crises, or we risk not just losing the opportunity of COVID, but also losing the opportunity to make the climate crisis change course as well.
Okay, that's enough for me for a bit. Grace, over to you. And do you want to start picking out some members and getting them to put their questions to Layla?
Yeah, I do. Okay. Let's see, where shall we begin? Iski Gordon, are you there?
Sure, thank you very much. There's a need for a change to the tax system. That's just a given. There's no point in discussing the need for that. UBI is expensive, and it does, if you're going to do it adequately, cost an enormous amount of money. But it will not have any direct effect on climate emergency, among other things. If, however, we were to focus on universal basic services, where we would be looking at not only encompassing an approach to climate emergency, housing, health and social care, education, it would also help reduce inequality in property values. So why are we still focusing, Compass is focusing, and I think the Lib Dems are, on UBI, universal basic income, whereas we should be focusing on universal basic services?
Right. So on that note, I mean, I've read some of these papers around the chatter between the two. Just to explain my journey towards this. So before COVID, I was very much a proponent of trialing a UBI. I didn't accept the premise that it doesn't work, because the questions that it was being measured against was basically around getting people back into jobs based on trials that were relatively short-lived. And I don't know if you guys saw, but last week, a Finnish university published a study which again showed that well-being did increase. But some of the qualitative data that was in that study was quite interesting, because it showed that people were making better decisions for their lives. They were choosing to take longer-term courses, for example. They were thinking more, they felt less anxious, and the well-being increased. But also, I think the how long that study went for, it was such a shame that it was stopped, but then they also made changes to the social security system, which meant that it might have been negated a bit. In COVID, the question for a UBI has been unequivocal. And just today, you know, we've seen the changes to the furlough scheme, and we know that there are people still falling through the cracks, having to rely on UC for the first time. I think this is a watershed moment, and that sort of basic income for an individual to choose what it is that they do next is really important. That doesn't stop us from also striving for really strong public services. And all the things that you've just mentioned are all things that need sorting. And I don't see it's an either or. And so I have seen this debate, and it's like we need to focus on one over the other. And my own view is that I think there's a balance of both, because I think they kind of do different things. And the way I would characterize this in terms of my own philosophy is I often see liberalism as being two things. You are free, you know, to be liberal, to be free, freedom. But there are two types of freedom. To be free to do something. And UBI gives you that security to make those choices about what it is that you want to do with your life. But in order to be truly free, you also need to be free from poverty and ill health. And that's where the strong public services come in. And if you are one or the other, you're not a real liberal. It's always both, and it's a balance between the two.
Right, moving on, having dealt with UBI, move on to something completely different. You should be able to speak to us now, Finn. You had a pretty good question, I think.
Well, it's how do you characterize your political differences with Ed David, the other Lib Dem candidate for the leadership? Because Ed David was responsible for energy during the coalition, and he agreed to promote nuclear energy, for instance, and didn't do that much on climate change. But that might just be one thing. I would like you to describe how you find the differences between the two of you.
Yeah. So Finn, I'm going to purposefully duck your question, because I don't think it's helpful when I have such respect for Ed, and actually I have a lot of respect for what he did in coalition. He did do a lot of the way that we've seen, for example, renewable energy burgeon in this country, in the market, in that he was just directly responsible for. And so I just don't think it's the right thing to say, well, I'm better than him because of this, that, and the other. So I think in the contest itself, I'm going to put my best foot forward, and people are going to be able to compare us directly. But what I can tell you is about why I think I'm the right person to lead our party right now. And I think to start with, it's because when I've gone on doors and asked people what they want from the Liberal Democrats and what they want us to focus on, it's things that I care passionately about, and it's things that I know I can communicate well. They tell me about equality of opportunity. They want to know that, you know, if they work hard in life and they are given the right opportunities, that they're going to get on. And that's, you know, actually a big part of that's education. And that's my mastermind subject. That's what I'm in it for. And it was a delight to hear them talk about that. I care deeply about the climate emergency, but it's not just about carbon emissions. It's also about biodiversity. And it's also about the way that that plays into how we look after ourselves and each other, and that interconnectivity between the human race and our planet. And actually that whole rounded way of looking at it, I think is, you know, for those who know this side of politics, you'll think that's not that radical, but you'll also appreciate that we have a lot of voters in the Lib Dems that this will sound very radical and very new to, and I think I'm best placed to be making that case. But the third thing I'll say is it's also about how you do politics and how you decide to lead. And so I'm very cooperative. I'm very much someone who brings the small voices from the corners of the room. When I was a teacher, as I said, my favorite student was the one in the class that said they hated it and spoke the least. You know, that's very much my ethos of how I lead and how I get the best out of people. and that's what I have to offer the Lib Dems. And if they then decide that they'd rather have someone else, I will back them completely and be that person anyway.
Well, it was a good answer. I felt a bit mean giving you that question, so well done. All right, okay, Sue, so you said that your specialist subject was education on Mastermind, so I've got an education question for you from Susan Stewart. Susan, are you there?
Hi.
Hi, Susan.
Hi, I was a maths teacher too, and I'm really interested in educational inequality. Education seems to have gone down the pecking order recently. You know, in the last election, it wasn't really an issue at all. Where do you think it's going to be after COVID? Is it going to be a priority area, or are we going to be too busy talking about all the other things?
I think, Susan, it's going to be right front and centre, because what's going to happen is I think it's inevitable that there are going to be industries that are going to, unfortunately, have to repurpose themselves, is the kind way of putting it. However, if we don't find ways to retrain people and to make people feel like they are also being retrained in something that they love. I mean, this is education. You know, education is that sort of self-actualization of getting people to work out what it is they want to do and then giving them the skills and the opportunities to be able to do it. It's going to be incredibly important that we get this right. And so actually adult education in particular, an area that has almost completely fallen off the radar, the political radar for years now, I think is going to be actually the way that we are going to recover from COVID, because we need to accept that, you know, things like the airline industry, things like the leisure industry, there may well be lots of businesses, unfortunately, that may not survive this. And to hark back to, you know, the 80s where just let them fold, I don't think is an option. And for what it's worth, I actually do think that there are voices in the Tory party who accept that this is going to have to be the way it is. I have no idea if Boris Johnson and the people around him have worked this out yet. But I genuinely hope that that lifelong learning, which has been so often, I mean, Susan, I don't know about you, but when I hear people say lifelong learning, it's often like a badge that they learn, you know, it's like a gimmick, but they don't really know what it means and they don't put any money behind it and they don't really, you know, engage with it. I think now it's going to be something we all engage with, and I think that's quite exciting.
All right, so changing the subject again completely. Richard Ashworth, you had your second question, I think, was an interesting one.
Layla, Jacinda Ardern has set the bar pretty high for, if you will, a female approach to leadership. Is hers the kind of sensitive, empathetic leadership you'd bring to bear?
Thanks, Richard. I mean, of course, I'm an admirer of hers, and you will see that New Zealand has come off pretty well in COVID. And there are all these tweets online about, look at all these countries that have done so well out of COVID, and isn't it interesting that they're all led by women? I mean, I don't really see it in terms of there is a female type of leadership. I think there is a type of leadership that I think is effective leadership, and it is cooperative. You still need to be able to take tough decisions, but you do it in such a way that is responsive to the people in front of you. And I'm not necessarily sure I think men do this too. There are great male leaders that also do this. And so I wouldn't necessarily just characterize it as just female. But if you're saying, do I want to be more Jacinda Ardern? Of course I do. I think she's a fabulous woman, but I hope to do it in my own way.
Let's talk about some more sort of Progressive Alliance stuff or progressive governments. Why do we only get progressive governments when the Tories are exhausted? What do you think?
Is that true? I'm not convinced it's necessarily true, because if
I read, he says, as in 1945, 1964, 1997.
Yeah, but when you've had the other side lose government, at the time they seemed exhausted too. So I'm not. So I think if what I'll interpret the question as is, you know, what is that positive offer, right? What is that positive offer that we can give people to get people to vote for progressive parties? I think it is. I mean, it's just a truism in British politics that because progressive parties have struggled to work together, there is a splitting of the vote under our electoral system that has meant it's easier for them and it's easier for the Tories, because even when the Brexit Party came along, actually the Brexit Party was never really a massive threat in parliamentary elections. And I think a lot of this isn't so much as we shouldn't be sort of beating ourselves around the back, you know, we don't have the right policies and we're not charismatic enough and we don't connect with people. We know that's not true. If you look at the last election, the progressive parties won. You know, if you add up all the votes together, that's what happened. So there is a plurality of people in this country that want our type of politics. It's just that we've got this electoral system that is thoroughly broken and makes us think what you just said, but I don't accept that. I don't think it's true. So that's why it's so important that we fight for electoral reform, because we do have a system that makes us almost second guess our own view of our society and where this country sits politically.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, so you talked a bit about the importance of trust in kind of achieving that kind of alliance. So I thought I'd bring in Ivor Gaber, who had a question about trust between parties.
Hi, Layla. Thanks very much. Really interesting to listen to you. You were talking about trust, not just in terms of your voters, but in terms of working with other parties.
Mm.
Has that been damaged by Keir Starmer's decision yesterday, I think it was, not to support the other opposition parties in calling for a delay in Brexit? How has that affected you? What do you think of the move?
Well, I mean, it was obviously disappointing, because I think one of the things that we'd already learned of Keir in his sort of brand was that he's pretty straight talking, and it felt, and given that he was Brexit secretary, he understands what's at stake here. He understands that if they don't ask for an extension in June, then that could mean that the Tories are going to lead us off that cliff edge of no deal. And the consequences of that, particularly for the communities that we in progressive politics care so deeply about, would be utterly catastrophic. So I don't understand why he said that. It felt like it was a bit of a political game he was playing, and maybe he's waiting and seeing. I mean, there are some who have said he's biding his time because he wants to reap the political rewards of the Tories getting that wrong. I don't know if that's true or not. Is he trying to sort of hold different bits of his own party together? I have no idea. But it was pretty disappointing. I have a feeling he might well change his stance as we get closer to June, I hope. But I do think there comes a moment where you don't just follow what's the best political route, but at times you have to try and lead people towards the outcome you desire. And I wish he had been much more forthright about the fact that it would have been so catastrophic for the country, he's just going to fight for it and that's the right thing to do. And I think that was the difficulty I had with the Labour Party stance during Brexit, was that it felt like they were putting politics above values. Except some of them didn't. Some of them had very deep-seated, socialist reasons why they didn't agree with the European project. But for a lot of them that sat on the fence, who really in their heart of hearts felt like they were Remainers and could see the values reasons why we needed to fight against Brexit and didn't, I really struggled with them. And I was very glad throughout that Brexit process that I was a Lib Dem, because I did sleep better at night, because my values and my politics were perfectly aligned. And I had many behind the scenes conversations with Labour MPs in particular who felt that they were being torn in two directions, and it really hurt them.
So while Grace finds the next question, what would you have done anything differently about how your party campaigned over Brexit, Layla?
Oh yeah. I think so. The initial stance to fight Brexit was absolutely the right one. But I think right from the get-go, we were so fixated on the outcome, which is to stop Brexit, we stopped telling people why. And that was a problem, because what that meant was we're now through the other end of this in terms of the eyes of the electorate. And when I speak to voters, and this was a large part why I felt like I needed to stand for leadership, voters tell me, they don't know what the Liberal Democrats stand for. They don't know these values that we stand for. And that's our mistake. You never blame the electorate for things like that. It's the party's mistake. I think we should have done that right from the beginning. But then I think there were specific mistakes at the last election. I mean, the revoke policy, the framing of the revoke policy was utterly wrong. And my take on that was that I think we again lost trust with the electorate over it, because it sounded very top down. An election is the one time that the electorate feel that they are our bosses, right? This is the one time that they will take away our jobs if we don't deserve it, and they will have their say, and they will come up to us on the street and they will give us their what's all. And this policy that we had, the way it was framed was like, if we get a majority, we're just going to revoke. And the framing was wrong, because obviously if the Lib Dems get a majority government in that election, it would be, they would feel like they wanted us to stop Brexit, but we said it too soon. So the way we should have said it was like, these are the values we stand for. This is why we want to stop Brexit. Every MP that you elect who's a Lib Dem is going to help in that fight and deliver a people's vote. But if you decided to bypass all of that and give us an outright majority, after all of those steps have been fulfilled, then obviously the logical thing that we would do is to accept that as a mandate to stop Brexit. But we started the wrong way round, and that's so Lib Dem. We always do that. We go straight for the logic and forget the heart that needs to come with it first.
Okay, a big question, I think, to draw towards the end. One from Colin Miller.
Hi, Layla. My question is, you've talked a lot about PR and the need for PR, and you've also talked about a kind of democratic and constitutional crisis which has been rolling on for a long time. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about what other forms of constitutional and democratic change you think needs to happen within the UK generally, but most particularly in England.
So what immediately comes to mind, because you say democratic crisis, and of course the one that's actually the most pressing one that is literally on the corner is the Scottish question, and the implications of the Scottish elections next year, the mandate that Nicola Sturgeon and others may take from, again, a good showing in that election, and the way that the Tories are just absolutely messing this up. And this was my concern about Brexit all along, was that was the iceberg that we were heading towards. We just couldn't see it for what it was. Speaking to my Scottish colleagues, but also speaking to colleagues in Wales, and interesting, also colleagues from around the country. So places like Cornwall, places like Yorkshire, there is a general sense of politics being too far away from people. And when they say to me, you know, what is it that are driving these movements for independence from Westminster? And I phrase it in those terms because, you know, obviously Cornwall and Yorkshire don't want to be independent countries in the same way, but it's the similar sentiment. And I think a lot of the answer to that is not just a change in the electoral system, bearing in mind a democracy isn't just about elections. A democracy is about decisions that are taken every day by all different levels of government. And I think we need to look carefully around a devolution deal for not just different nations of the United Kingdom, but also different regions. And it's a thought that I've been playing around with for a long time. And it speaks, I think, very strongly to the very liberal Democrat values. We are very community minded. That's why I joked earlier, we love a local election. But the reason we love a local election isn't just because we often win better at them, and that's true. But the reason we win is because we are very good at it. And we appreciate that people like to know that the decisions that are affecting them, you know, the bins that go out, you know, you talked about looking at the cracks in the pavement, Neil, and I nearly joked, don't you do a pothole down? We love a good pothole as Lib Dems. Like, but it really matters because those are the decisions that people see day in, day out. And if those decisions are wrong, or they feel like those drip, low-level decisions, not the big questions, the things that really matter, those low-level things aren't things they agree with, their trust in democracy as a whole erodes. And so I think that has also contributed to why our democracy has been in a slow and steady decline, particularly over the last 10, 15 years. And I would love to see that reversed. And to the credit of the Labour Party after 97, you know, we had those huge devolution deals that happened at that point, but I think there is so much more that we can and should be doing.
Okay, so apparently we've got time for one more question. So the one that I thought we could do is Alan Story, who has a question about the Labour Party.
Hello, Alan. Yes, we can.
Hi, my name is Alan Story from Sheffield. I'm from a group called Get PR Done. And my question is, our strategy, I want to know, see what you think of it, is that in order to get PR done, the priority must be to win over the Labour Party. If we don't do that, we're really not getting anywhere. I'm in the Green Party. We can't get anywhere. Simply, you know, I mean, no one could be more committed than Canon Lucas and, you know, youth people, etc., to PR. We have to win over the Labour Party. Is that the correct strategy, is the priority? And if so, how do we do that?
Really good question. And Alan, I mean, first of all, on your point around that's what we need to try and do, I think you're right. I found it really interesting and helpful that there are a number of voices now in a lot of the different, I mean, I'm not an expert in the Labour Party, it's not my party, but of all the factions in the Labour Party, there's a large number of them now that do seem to be pushing towards some kind of electoral reform. The problem with electoral reform is that we quite often cut off our nose to spite our face, or, you know, let the best be the enemy of the good. How different would this all be had we adopted AV? And the reason why a lot of Lib Dems didn't vote for the AV in the AV referendum is because they felt that it wasn't PR enough. And so I think that is a problem, because we need to kind of work out what form of PR it is that we maybe want. And I think it's a good start to try and win the basic argument in the Labour Party. But I think one of the things we could actively work on together is working out, well, what are the different tensions in PR? And there are constituency link versus not, democratic accountability to the party. These are all well trodden. How do we do it in such a way that we can all agree on the type of PR and push for that? Because my concern, even if we did win over the argument in the Labour Party, is that then if it got to, let's say, for sake of argument, a situation where you did have parties in a progressive alliance of some description government, and you had to draw up an agreement about what that PR would look like, and then you found yourselves on different sides, you end up fighting each other and you lose the opportunity again. I mean, it would just be pointless. So let's start thinking 2 steps ahead. So I think you're right to start there, Alan, but let's not forget the step after that. What could we agree on?
Maybe we could, I mean, if we had a progressive alliance style government with a mandate for that, we could always give that to a citizens' convention to decide the form of PR, exactly. and not allow that to come back. But anyway, that's for another day, and Compass are working hard with Make Votes Matter and lots of other pro-PR organisations trying to win Labour over in particular to PR, and there's a reasonable chance that that could happen. So let's see about that. Finally tonight, Layla, so Compass is a very hopeful, optimistic organisation. We believe a good society is both feasible and desirable. We start with a belief in the best of everybody. Where does your sense of hope and possibility come from? What gets you out of bed and keeps you working and campaigning for liberal democracy and green issues and equality issues, etc.?
Yeah, I think fundamentally it's the belief that you can change things. Things can change. It's not the case that we live in a country that is sort of so authoritarian that there's almost no point in even giving it a go. I love that we live in a democracy that allows the plurality of ideas and encourages diversity of thought. And more than that, if you go out there, the person who gets up in the morning and actually goes and knocks on the doors and delivers the leaflets, you can lead, not just follow, but lead public opinion, and you can make things happen. And actually, I've had this in COVID. So I called for a coronavirus compensation scheme quite early on in this. I had a constituent actually who contacted me, heartbreaking, saying, you know, I'm an NHS worker. I'm really worried for my daughter. Me and my wife are both NHS workers. What happens to us if we die because of COVID? Would we get financial compensation like in the army? And I said, that's just heartbreaking. Of course you should. And then I realized they don't. And so we started calling for it. And what was amazing in that campaign was, like, Tories came on board, the Daily Express, I mean, not my biggest fan most of the time, to be perfectly honest with you, came on board on this campaign, and we've made it happen. And so now these grieving families have a little bit of an extra cushion. And when you do that, that buzz you get from making the world a better place gives me hope, because then there's something worth fighting for, because you can actually achieve it. And so anyone out there who, I'm sure there are most people who are on this call are probably people who engage with this kind of thing anyway, but my hope is that everyone realizes that even one person can make a big difference.
Fantastic. Well, let's hope that you make even more of a difference in your party and across the parties, Layla, in the future. Thanks so much for being part of this conversation tonight, which we can all listen to again on a podcast later on in the week. Thank you for all of the members who have been on the call tonight. Thank you for being here and asking your questions. Next week's call will be a little bit different. It's going to be a book launch for something called Left Unity, a manifesto for a progressive alliance, when we'll be joined by the book's author, Marius Ostrowski, journalist Paul Mason, Labour MP Clive Lewis, and former Green MEP Molly Scott-Cato. It should be a fascinating conversation as usual, and I can't wait. So, if you like what you've heard today and want to be part of a much more equal, democratic and sustainable future, a good society, then visit us at compassonline.org.uk/podcast, and you'll be able to join us live on future calls just like this one. You can tweet me at Neil, NEAL _Compass, or Compass at Compass Office. And if you've enjoyed this week's episode, please give us a rating. It will help us reach more listeners in the future. And it's only fair that they know it's bloody complicated too.